Scusate, questo è adesso, ripetiamo che l'evento è in inglese, in lingua inglese, ma c'è una traduzione in italiano, per cui chi avesse necessità di sentire in italiano, fuori a destra ci sono le radioline e voi. Grazie.
If everyone would like to take their seats, then maybe we can get this started. A very good evening, or good afternoon to you all, and welcome to this event, Common Good Practice and Theory, which will see a dialogue with the two most influential and interesting ladies. The Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Motley, on my left, and Professor in Economics of Innovation and Public Value at University College London, Mariana Mazzucato, on my right past Monsignor Vincenzo Paglia. Mazzucato is also a member of the Pontifical Academy for Life, an institution founded in 1994 dedicated to promoting the Church's consistent life ethic, and which is also involved in related research on bioethics and moral theology. Before providing a more detailed introduction of our speakers, let me first thank the President of the Academy, Archbishop Vincenzo Paglia, for hosting us here for this very special occasion and rare opportunity to hear these two exceptional ladies hold an important conversation for today's world. Briefly about myself, my name is Sabina Castelfranco. I'm a journalist with CBS News and produce investigative stories and features for 60 Minutes and Sunday Morning, the two most popular magazine shows in the US. I've worked for CBS for the past 30 years, but also worked for most major English news media outlets like BBC and Al Jazeera, and started my career here in Italy at RAI and Vatican Radio. I would also like to thank all of our listeners who are following us and watching us on YouTube. To begin with, Monsignor Paglia has a message from Pope Francis, which he will be reading out, and then he has some opening remarks. Monsignor Paglia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I will speak in Italian. La lingua degli angeli. Leggo anzitutto il messaggio di Papa Francesco. Sono molto lieto di porgere il mio cordiale saluto a tutti i partecipanti all'incontro Bene Comune, Teoria e Pratica organizzato dalla Pontifical Academy per la Vita. All'interno delle molteplici riflessioni sul tema del bene comune, l'incontro è particolarmente significativo per almeno due motivi. Il primo è che è promosso dalla Pontifical Academy per la Vita. Se si vuole realmente custodire la vita umana in ogni contesto e situazione, non si può prescindere dal collocare i temi della vita, anche quelli più classici del dibattito bioetico, nel contesto sociale e culturale in cui tali fenomeni accadono. Una difesa della vita che si limita solo ad alcuni aspetti o momenti e che non tiene conto in modo integrale di tutte le dimensioni esistenziali, sociali e culturali, rischia di essere inefficace e può cadere nella tentazione di un approccio ideologico dove si difendono più i principi astratti che le persone concrete. La ricerca del bene comune e della giustizia sono aspetti centrali e imprescindibili di qualunque difesa di ogni vita umana, soprattutto le più fragili e indifese, nel rispetto dell'intero ecosistema che abitiamo. Il secondo motivo che vorrei sottolineare è che a questo evento saranno presenti due donne con responsabilità e provenienze diverse. Abbiamo bisogno, nella società come nella Chiesa, di ascoltare voci femminili. Abbiamo bisogno che saperi diversi cooperino all'elaborazione di una riflessione ampia e saggia sul futuro dell'umanità. Abbiamo bisogno che davvero tutte le culture mondiali possano offrire il loro contributo ed esprimere bisogni e risorse. Solo così possiamo pensare e generare un mondo aperto, come auspicato nel capitolo 3 della mia enciclica Fratelli Tutti. Con riferimento a questa enciclica desidero rimarcare che la fraternità universale è in qualche modo un modo personale, caldo, di intendere il bene comune, non semplicemente un'idea, un progetto politico e sociale, piuttosto una comunione di volti, di storie e di persone. Il bene comune è anzitutto una pratica fatta di accoglienza fraterna e di comune ricerca della verità e della giustizia. Nel nostro mondo, segnato da tanti conflitti e contrapposizioni che sono frutto dell'incapacità di alzare lo sguardo oltre interessi particolari, è di grande importanza richiamare il bene comune, uno dei capisaldi della dottrina sociale della Chiesa. Abbiamo bisogno di solide teorie economiche che assumano e sviluppino questo tema nel suo specifico, affinché possa diventare un principio effettivamente ispiratore delle scelte politiche, come ho indicato nella mia enciclica Laudato Si, e non soltanto una categoria tanto invocata nelle parole quanto disattesa nei fatti. Di cuore benedico tutti, chiedendo per favore di pregare per me. Città del Vaticano, 12 novembre 2024. Francesco. Questo è il messaggio di Papa Francesco che ci invita ad essere personali e caldi anche questa sera. Parleremo del bene comune, ma appunto non di un'idea. Vorremmo, con il titolo Teoria e Pratica, entrare nel vivo di questo nostro tema così cruciale, e lo faremo appunto, che ringrazio davvero di cuore sia la prima ministra Mia Motley e l'amica, posso dire così, Mariana Mazzucato, con la quale abbiamo organizzato e pensato questo momento già da qualche tempo. Alcune brevissime riflessioni da parte mia. Mai il mondo è stato così ricco, eppure mai ci sono stati tanti poveri e mai le disuguaglianze così dilatate. Mi chiedo, se l'1% della popolazione mondiale possiede il 46% delle risorse disponibili, se il 10% ne possiede l'80% e il 50%, ossia la metà della popolazione del mondo, non possiede nulla, dite, può reggere la convivenza dei popoli, la pace nel mondo è senza dubbio il pericolo. Se 70 milioni di persone hanno nelle loro mani la stessa ricchezza che possiedono i restanti 8 miliardi di persone. Il miliardo di persone che vive in condizioni di povertà assoluta e che si trova nei paesi economicamente più arretrati, dei quali circa la metà si trova in Asia meridionale, un terzo nell'Africa subsahariana e una quota di rilievo anche in America Latina. Questo miliardo di persone non farà sentire prima o poi la propria disperazione. Si tratta di un vasto popolo ammassato in condizioni di vita subumane, tutti vittime innocenti di situazioni che l'ordine politico mondiale non è in grado di regolare o non vuole regolare. Sono scarti che nessuno vuole. Ecco perché l'Accademia per la Vita non può non interessarsi anche di questo. Tra le cause di tali squilibri vi è la politica delle grandi potenze, che spinge a praticare complesse strategie nelle quali si sovrappongono la competizione mercantilistica tra gli stati, il regionalismo economico e il protezionismo settoriale. L'ossessione per l'efficienza economico-finanziaria avvantaggia i ceti dominanti e porta alla discriminazione dei cittadini non abbienti, in particolare i migranti, trattati come barbari invasori, anzi criminalizzati. Il processo di globalizzazione del solo mercato sta aggravando ulteriormente gli squilibri sociali non risolti dal welfare state. La competizione globale impone infatti la concorrenza soprattutto nei settori produttivi più deboli, a cominciare dalla forza lavoro. Il lavoro dipendente è ormai scarso, precario, segmentato, poco retribuito. Facile che da questo scenario si passi a conseguenze violente. Le Nazioni Unite, che hanno posto come uno degli obiettivi per il millennio la vittoria sulla povertà, parliamo di 24 anni fa ovviamente, sono smentite dai fatti. L'obiettivo non solo non è stato raggiunto, ma si è allargata la forbice ancor più della disuguaglianza. Non basta dire che la ricchezza in cifra totale è cresciuta, se poi aumentano drammaticamente le aree di emarginizzazione e di esclusione dalla vita sia all'interno dei singoli stati sia tra le aree del mondo. Le drammatiche disuguaglianze non sono frutto del caso, e ancor meno mandate da Dio, per cui bisognerebbe rassegnarsi. Le disuguaglianze sono il frutto di un capitalismo esasperato che ha generato una cultura iperindividualista che sta portando verso il crollo di quel noi che solo rende possibile una convivenza pacifica tra individui e popoli diversi. Il rabbino Jonathan Sachs, morto purtroppo 4 anni or sono, mentre sottolinea la dignità di ogni singolo individuo perché creato da Dio, Bezalel Elohim, a immagine di Dio, individua nell'iperindividualismo la causa drammatica della solitudine delle folle, con la distruzione di quella spinta sociale costitutiva dell'umano. E ha ragione il metropolita ortodosso Anastasio, che ho visitato la settimana scorsa a Tirana, il quale ama dire che l'opposto della pace non è la guerra, ma l'egoismo, dal quale derivano tutte le guerre. E oggi ce ne sono 59 attive, 59. Le guerre sono l'opposto del bene comune, sono il male universale. Non può esistere oggi una guerra giusta, perché oggi le guerre, qualunque esse siano, producono morti, a volte milioni, e sono causa di tutte le povertà. L'urgenza di riflettere sul bene comune non è solo un utile esercizio di pensiero, è la condizione previa per una giustizia planetaria, ossia la realizzazione del bene comune dell'intera famiglia umana, di tutti i popoli, nessuno escluso. La dichiarazione di dignità umana del Vaticano II definisce così il bene comune: è l'insieme delle condizioni sociali grazie alle quali gli uomini possono perseguire il loro perfezionamento più riccamente o con maggiore facilità. Il bene comune dunque non è qualcosa di definito in astratto e avulso dai cambiamenti della storia. L'idea di bene comune vive infatti quasi lo stesso destino dell'idea di diritto naturale, tanto irrinunciabile dal punto di vista funzionale come un limite invariabile del potere politico, quanto sostanzialmente ancorata ai diversi passaggi storici. E chiudo. Il bene comune, per definizione, è una dimensione che deve coinvolgere l'intera società. E la prima delle caratteristiche di qualunque società è la sua intima pluralità. La società, infatti, è una polis, è un insieme di sfere sociali, tra loro connesse ma anche distinte, nel quale si persegue la cura di più beni economici, culturali, religiosi, politici, e ciascuna di queste sfere sociali incide, direi di fatto ma anche di diritto, sulla provvista del bene comune. Insomma, bene comune e pluralismo delle sfere sociali finiscono per richiamarsi a vicenda. In una concezione dinamica di bene comune, il pluralismo sociale è una componente essenziale. Società non pluraliste non sono in grado di assicurare il perseguimento del bene comune. A questo punto io sono particolarmente lieto di poter ospitare questo evento che, a mio avviso, da questa piccola sala ha però un orizzonte che riguarda l'intero pianeta. Qui abbiamo l'ambizione di rappresentare tutti i popoli del mondo, nessuno escluso. Grazie.
Thank you, Monsignor Paglia. I would now like to say some words about our two speakers before handing over to them. On my left, Mia Amor-Motley became Barbados' 8th and first female Prime Minister in May 2018 and was re-elected in 2022. She was first elected to the Parliament of Barbados in September 1994, one of the youngest persons ever to be assigned a ministerial portfolio. She was appointed Minister of Education, Youth Affairs and Culture. Later, she served as Attorney General, Deputy Prime Minister, and Leader of the Opposition before she became Prime Minister. In addition to her responsibility as head of the government in Barbados, Ms. Motley is known throughout the world for her influential leadership in fighting climate change and financing the global transition to a stable economy, but also as a voice on development, equity, and the sharing of public goods. On my right, Mariana Mazzucato, as I mentioned earlier, is Professor in the Economics of Innovation and Public Value at University College London, where she is the founding director of the UCL Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. She is one of the world's most influential economists today. Her work challenges orthodox thinking about the role of the state and the private sector in driving innovation, how economic value is created, measured and shared, and how market-shaping policy can be designed in a mission-oriented way to solve the grand challenges facing humanity. Professor Mazzucato also acts as an advisor to a wide range of governments and organizations around the world. I'm now delighted to hand over to our speakers, and then we'll have a conversation. Prime Minister and Professor, the floor is yours. First, Professor Mazzucato.
Buonasera a tutti, comincio in italiano e poi proseguo in inglese così capite meglio. E prima di tutto grazie moltissimo al Monsignor Paglia che ha accettato di fare questo incontro. Eravamo in un ristorante un anno fa e abbiamo plottato questo incontro pensando, adesso forse continuo in inglese così la prima ministra mi capisce. We were plotting about this event, thinking what would be the most inspirational meeting that we could organize in honor, actually, of Pope Francis's very inspiring work in the Laudato Si on the common good. And we thought that Mia Motley, Prime Minister of Barbados, who is not only leading in her own country with that concept, and I'm sure we'll get to this in a second, but especially at the global level, trying to help the world rethink the international financial architecture in a moment where that financial architecture is part of the problem that we are facing. We don't have the fiscal space that's required for many countries to actually combat some of the severest problems of our time. They're paying much more in debt than they are paying on education, on social problems, let alone on climate change, both the mitigation and adaptation. And she does it with an extreme sense of, I think, urgency, which we often don't have. This is why we had teenagers around the world protesting about this generation's laziness. Fridays for the Future was very much a result of that impatience that the new generations feel and the lack of action. But she's also extremely concrete of what needs to be done. And my own inspiration for this event is that I actually believe that Pope Francis is much more concrete about what needs to be done than most economists. The concept of the common good, as Pope Francis talks about it, has very specific principles underlying it that would hold the system to account, as opposed to just fluffy words about global public goods and the common good, as is often argued by economists. principle of solidarity. He talks about the principles of the preferential option for the poor to always judge any activity and policy in terms of how it affects the most vulnerable people first. He talks about the principle of subsidiarity, so actually bringing our actions to the most local level and making sure we have the voices of those people who are experiencing, for example, a policy at the table to design that change. So these are all really important concepts that we need to be bringing to the table when we talk about the biggest problems of our time, whether it's climate change, the problem of biodiversity, the problem of health, and how weak our global health systems are. It is impossible to tackle those problems unless we have underlying principles of how we must behave and interact one with another. And why it's so important to use these ideas to challenge standard economic thinking, and yes, I'm an economist, I've written quite a few books about these ideas, is that in traditional economics, at best we talk about public goods, which, one word is good, two words, half of which is in theory good, as really just correcting a type of market failure. So we need, for example, state investment in global public goods because we don't have enough private sector investment in those areas. And so we start thinking in terms of gaps, financial gaps, as though there's like a hole to fill with money. We think of different market failures that need to be fixed with different types of bandages, whether it's due to positive externalities, which underlies the ideas of public goods, because the spillovers are so great, but not enough investment in them because the private sector can't profit from it, or negative externalities when the private sector does too much of something that's bad, so the state has to come in and patch it up with something like a carbon tax. And all these market failures absolutely exist, but the point of inspiration that we should be taking from a much deeper concept of the common good, not just the public good, is that whereas the public good has been framed as a correction, the common good starts already as an objective, not a correction. It's an objective that we need to reach around net zero, around strengthening our global health systems, so in the next pandemic we're actually prepared to tackle it, so we don't have this massive cost of excess deaths as we did. It talks about the, again, objectives, but the point is that the how we reach those objectives is just important as the what. Think, as Monsignor Padilla just talked about in terms of ancient, even political philosophy, the common good already has that kind of thinking. Think of Aristotle, there's the telos, not the goal, but also the polis, the democracy. Of course, the ancient Greeks excluded from the polis of the democracy women and slaves, so we need to modernize that thinking, but the debate, the contestation, the way we talk to each other, the way we respect each other, the way we value each other matters in the way that we then approach the goals, the common good. What we then debate is good for us all. And the common good thought this way is so powerful because, again, then it holds the system to account. Think of what happened with COVID. Was the goal simply vaccines? Of course not. The goal was to make sure that everyone in the world had access to those vaccines. So then if you work backwards, how we produce that vaccine, how we have solidarity to produce that vaccine and distribute the vaccine instead of having what we ended up having, as Dr. Tedros, the head of the World Health Organization, calls vaccine apartheid, matters. So the how different countries work together, the how the public and the private sectors work together with true collective intelligence and knowledge sharing at the center matters if we think about these common good principles and that common good goal. It's not just things, right? We ended up with 8 vaccines. That was not the goal. It was making sure that the whole world was protected during COVID. And so this concept is extremely important, and actually grounding it in such a way that then allows us to tackle, again, the biggest problems of our time. And the Prime Minister has just come back from Baku, COP for climate. I've just come back from the COP16 on biodiversity, and we do not currently have the action that we require globally to treat these problems collectively, systemically, and in an economy-wide way. And we shouldn't just think it's due to laziness. The real need to actually have a new framework that allows us, again, to hold all the different actors to account and to make sure that we treat these problems with the same kind of urgency that we treat wars. Why is it that during war money comes out of thin air? In many countries, think of Germany, a year ago there was a big debate. In fact, the government is falling as we speak because of debates over the budget. But for war, money came out of thin air. And it's always been true. No one ever said, we're not going to Vietnam because there's no money. We're not going to fight World War I because there's no money. We're not going to fight World War II because there's no money. Money literally is created to fight wars. And how that money is created is done in an outcomes-oriented way. And we end up with public and private actors working together to solve different problems because the states then think that those are urgent problems that are time-bound. You don't say, we will win the war in 30 years. You say, we want to do it in a month. But how terrible is it that we need to use a metaphor of war, especially now where we have these geopolitical crises, in order to say, hey, we actually know how to do this stuff. Right, in war times. We even finally woke up during COVID and realized it wasn't going to be solved if we just put a bit of money here and there. Many countries woke up and used, for example, outcomes-oriented procurement. A big percentage of government budgets, instead of just contracting here or there. During COVID, it took too long, but many countries woke up and thought we have a goal, which is to prevent these massive numbers of deaths, and so we need to change the instruments that we have at our disposal to be more mission and outcomes oriented. But do we really have to wait for millions of people to die due to a health pandemic? Do we really need to wait for wars to remind us that money can be created to achieve, urgent national security goals? Why don't we use that same kind of reasoning for all of our social problems in terms of the health inequities, in terms of the massive problem we have currently in terms of the biodiversity loss, in terms of the huge problem that we have around water? I recently co-chaired the Global Commission on the Economics of Water. We have 2 billion people across the world that still don't have access to safely managed water. We have 1 child under the age of 5 that dies every 80 seconds due to polluted water. These are local problems, these are regional problems, these are national problems, they're global problems. The deforestation of the Amazon has been shown to be directly related to water problems in other parts of the world in terms of the droughts and the floods. So it's impossible to have water nationalism. It's impossible to have vaccine nationalism. These problems have to be addressed collectively, systemically, and in an economy-wide way. But if we don't actually reinvent also the underlying economics of it, and hence this kind of revival of this notion of the common good as the goal, where the how matters as much as the what. And we distributed an article that I just wrote about this, with these kind of different principles about collective knowledge sharing, collective reward sharing, clear objectives, where again the how matters as much as the what, then we are not going to advance. We will just keep talking about the problems, but we will always be too little too late in reacting ex post instead of designing the relationships between all the different actors ex ante in a pre-distributed way, not waiting for the mess and just doing it in a redistributed way. It will be impossible to change the system, and we will not be able to tackle these immense problems that we have. And so just to finish off, because we said we would keep this quite short in order to have as much dialogue between us as possible, I really think that in this moment of such distrust also of our global political systems, the kind of populism that we're seeing across the world. We just had a US election that taught us a lot about how so many people really feel left behind, disenfranchised, and are using their votes in some ways as votes of protest. We can also see it in that way, just people who have not felt that they were being valued, even, by the way, in states that the Biden agenda economically had huge success. You still didn't have people somehow trusting or feeling part of that solution, right? So how do we actually bring participation, co-creation to the table in this process? And in this moment of distrust, in this moment of populism, in this moment of xenophobia, in this moment of huge geopolitical tension, I think it's extremely important to listen to the words of those leaders like the Prime Minister of Barbados, who are not only incredibly inspiring, but who work at the local level, at the national level, and at the global level to bring these concepts of solidarity and to bring them at the most concrete level in terms of national finance, global finance, and again, hold the system to account and don't mince their words at these large global conferences, whether it's the COP conference or the World Bank conferences, to really make sure that we are all working collectively because we simply do not have time to waste. So thank you so much. I'm very happy to be on stage here with this wonderful group of people who I hope we can debate a bit after we hear from them.
And now the floor is yours, Prime Minister.
Thank you very much, Sabina. May I say, Monsignor Pania and Mariana, my dear friend, I want to thank you. Sometime back in February, I received a WhatsApp and a photograph from Mariana establishing the scene of the crime that led to the plot. And as a result of that early planning, we are here today in less than 1 year. I hope, Monsignor, that our other conversations will allow us to act with dispatch too on my side of the world with respect to bringing persons together to help advance the agenda of the common good and to help make this world a better place. The reality is that we're taught as children to be the best persons that we can be. We are reminded as adults that we should not lose that objective. And we come to public life often, most of us, with a desire to achieve those same objectives, but at a different scale. We live in a world today that is no longer pretending that that is what it wants. And in a very real sense, COVID unmasked much of the discrepancies and I'm tempted to say the hypocrisy of much of what the world has presided over, in spite of the fact that 80 years ago, with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we asserted globally that each human being has dignity and ought to be treated in a dignified manner. That reflects very much the teachings of the New Testament. And it should always be our guide. But unless we establish a policy framework, and unless we have the cooperation that allows us to walk that walk and not just talk it, we're not going to be able to achieve these objectives. Long before I thought of coming here, I was inspired particularly by the writings of two men who are anchored deeply in spirituality and religion. Monsignor, you quoted one of them, and you read from the other. I refer to Chief Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, who is no longer with us, but whose work in the politics of hope and the dignified dignity of difference set up very clearly all of the things that we are really trying to do here in terms of respecting and bringing dignity to each individual, but ensuring that dignity is not just paternalistic and looking down, but it is in fact rooted in being able to give them a full opportunity to participate and to benefit and to live. In 2016, And my senior minister of health is who is also the general secretary of my political party. We set about carrying to our party's highest decision-making body a document called the Covenant of Hope. It was not by accident. And many people said to us at the time, we were mad, because you can't get a party to agree to this kind of document and to go through it page by page by page. And we said, okay, nothing is wrong with being mad, we'll try it. And that document defines covenant through a quotation from Jonathan Sachs, that a covenant occurs when each of us comes together to achieve that which we cannot achieve individually. I start here because I really want, even you, Mariana, don't know these stories, to give you context that we speak today as a country, not because we want attention, but because we are rooted in the belief that what we are doing is the right way to bring up the levels of development and opportunity and to protect those who are most vulnerable. That covenant of hope inspires us in all of our policies that we produce. But I go further. You may ask why Barbados, 166 square miles, has the audacity to believe that it can speak on the global financial architecture and to work with others. Next year will represent 400 years that the British first landed in our country, in May next year. And they used Barbados as their basis for production, and it was called in the 17th century their jewel in the crown. But they passed through Parliament a piece of legislation called the Slave Code of 1661 that came to define all other slave codes in the Americas, or not all of them, the majority of other slave codes in the Americas. Some exactly in the same words, and others with us as a platform from which they then did more. It is not something of which we are proud. And those of us who are the children of an independent Barbados believe that in the same way we were able to influence the Americas and the world for wrong and for things which we can never change history, that we must now do the things for good. And I give you and even though I'm not has been his whole his works have defined for us in a very simple way what is required of us as human beings, at the individual, but also at the level of the society, and I dare say at the level of countries. The world is at an inflection point, and almost every aspect of what is not going good for us is man-made. The climate crisis has been brought about by an excessive use of industrialization without balance. The pandemics have equally been as a result of different circumstances conspiring, whether we look at the traditional pandemic or when we look at the slow motion pandemic of excessive use of antibiotics in the build-up of antimicrobial resistance. The digital divide is as a result of the inequity that has allowed one set of people to benefit at the expense of others, and the potential for unregulated AI to shape global society in ways that will only consolidate inequity is potentially there, largely because of how we have developed AI and how we have failed to ensure that the public space is the dominant feature of determining what should be done rather than the pursuit of private wealth. The conflicts and the wars that we have are all man-made. And like His Holiness, I genuinely believe that if you have factories making weapons, then you have to find a purpose for those weapons to be used. If not, the factory will no longer have business as it goes forward. And that fundamentally, what we are doing is finding reasons for people to stay in conflict, to sustain a military-industrial complex that commands far too much of the taxpayers' money, rather than that money going into the prevention of war and to the resolution of conflict among people. And then, of course, food and water insecurity exists simply because we can find a way to put a man on the moon, but we cannot find a way to distribute the ample food and water that exists on earth. All of these things are man-made. They, to be solved, require moral strategic leadership at a global level. In many ways, you may say that the voices that you hear are the same voices that you've heard all along, and that the public is not responding to those voices and they've gone in another direction. I've been in politics long enough to know that elections very often are not decided on principle, they're decided on many other things, including who's in front of me and who is courting me the most. And to that extent, therefore, I do not confuse doing good with the outcome of an election. We are at a stage where I think there is need for a rethinking of the global financial system in a fundamental way. If we were to fight, if we were to form the World Bank today, it would not be simply to do what it was formed to do 80 years ago. But it would also be the guardian of the global public commons and the guardian of the common good. And largely because we live in a world that is so interdependent that the reality of the failings of the least of us can affect the entire global landscape. And it is that recognition that requires us now to be able to think and take action afresh. Most people don't believe it is possible purely because they are comfortable in the status quo. But if we were to form a new institution or adjust the workings of an existing institution, we would soon recognize that the world as we found it cannot rely on public money alone, because governments across the world have so militarized their role that they have allowed wealth to dominate in the private space without ensuring that the public good and the common good has been served both at the national level, far less the international level. That is why we, along with the President of Kenya and the President of France, have served to work on a global solidarity committee to find levies and to find things that will help us secure this common good. And as Mariana said most appropriately, that we are not looking for a course correction, but we are looking to set objectives for what we should do. I want to recognize my dear friend Martin Guzman, who is also here, who, as Minister of Finance in Argentina when he served, was also one of those voices trying to shape this world. The reality is that the multinational corporations of the world have larger balance sheets than more than 2/3 of the countries of the world. The fact that there is a global minimum tax and an agreement from the OECD on Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, although we don't know where that will end up now in the future. But the fact that that exists and that President Biden moved with alacrity to join other OECD members in 2021, to make that happen, tells you that the major countries of the world, developed countries, believe that there is insufficient tax income coming to their own country, and that the multinational corporations have effectively gotten away with being able to spirit their revenue offshore or elsewhere, and that there is insufficient taxes being paid. We believe that the principles that ought to guide us are principles that are reflected as much in the New Testament as they are in the principles of equity and justice. The polluter pays principle is not a new principle, and it effectively actually anchors itself back in law, and certainly the common law, which I can speak to, as opposed to civil law, where you are responsible for your actions, whether in tort or in contract, and you have to stand accountable for them. That polluters pays principle carries us to the point of saying that if your actions have helped to contribute to the problem, then you ought to leave something on the table to help solve the problem. And we go further. If your actions also will lead to you benefiting from providing the solution, but benefiting egregiously, in other words, in excess of a 20% or 25% rate of return, then you too ought to leave a little something on the table. I have been speaking these things and will continue to do so over and over, and continue to find allies. Because when we start to do the numbers dwarf the obligations that we have been relying on from G7 countries that have not materialized. We were promised 100 billion, didn't come. We were promised 0.7% of GNI. The majority of countries as aid haven't done it. And when they seek to tell you that they're doing it, you need to go and check quickly, because it's not only greenwashing that exists in the world, but it is also double and triple accounting for the same money very often. So do we spend time lamenting the fact that those who ought to do more are not doing more? Or do we take a laser-like approach and start to be able to create new systems of governance and new sources of funding? We favor the latter. If we can get, for example, a recognition that shipping contributes 3% of global emissions, but it doesn't contribute a cent towards countries adapting and becoming more resilient. They're not invested sufficiently in changing out their ships so that they can minimize the extent to which those emissions are sent. If we took the fact that shipping has a value last year roughly of about $7 trillion, and you were to take a 1% levy, 1%, you would raise $70 billion minimum. And more importantly, instead of it being a one-off contribution, it would be an annual contribution. And it would allow the ships, the owners of the ships, to convert and build new ships. But more importantly, it would be a source of funding to develop resilience in coastal infrastructure and other matters pertaining to how we can prevent, for example, the erosion that will lead to the destruction of water aquifers and reservoirs, that once there is salt water intrusion, those are lost forever. And that comes on top of an already worrisome situation of declining groundwater across the world because of the climate crisis. If we were to take aviation and say, let us put a compulsory fee for business class, first class, and private jets, but for economy, we want to have a double benefit, let us not make it mandatory, but try to create agency among all persons traveling and let them decide, will you contribute $5 to save the planet in domestic travel? Will you contribute $10 with international travel? And more often than not, we've seen it. Most people in the United States of America go to the counter and they say, will you round up and donate your change in the rounding up to a local charity of some type or another? The majority of people once sensitized want to make a difference, but we don't give them the opportunity so to do. Oil and gas, no doubt, they've contributed to the problem. If we were to look at taxing them on the basis of their emissions per ton of CO2 emitted, we reckon that we can raise at least $200 billion a year. And if we were to take and put a small levy, Martin, of 0.1%, 0.1% on all trades of stocks and bonds, that would raise us just over $480 billion a year. I haven't gone into any depth, but just with those 3 examples or 4 examples, we can raise in excess of $700 billion a year. And out of that, yes, the majority might go to climate, but we need to leave some for pandemics because we are not a one-issue species. We can save the planet and end up dying from a pandemic. We can save and end up dying from crime. And to that extent, therefore, and you've seen in the US the difference between how people vote when they are exposed to education and when they're not. And it is largely as a result of that dichotomy that they face that some of the issues that we take for granted cannot be taken for granted because we've not broken it down and spoken to people and with people and given them an opportunity to be heard. I give you these examples because I believe that it is not only appropriate for us to speak about the pursuit of the common good. That is the way, and that is what we must achieve. That is the objective. But it is now important for us to flesh out and map out how it can happen and how it must happen internationally. At the national level, it is a matter of domestic policy priorities. And you either are going to see people, feel people, and hear people, and act accordingly, or you are going to pay the consequences of it. History is replete with examples of what happens when the majority of the people are ignored. And it is only a matter of time before people take matters into their own hands. Monsignor, you spoke about the abundance of wealth on this earth, on this planet, and the absence of equity and sharing, combined with the technology that we now have, which makes every citizen an active agent if they wanted to be. And even when they're not educated, as we now know, and even the fake news, as we now know. These things do not make for a good outcome. The one thing that we must be mindful of is the arrogance of human beings in believing that it will not happen to us, and that our species, will never become extinct, and that civilizations do not fail. But I am in the city of Roma, and we all know what happens to civilizations. And I come from a region that had a beautiful country called Montserrat, known as the Emerald Isle. And Montserrat now has probably a quarter of the population that it had when I was growing up. Because when the volcanic eruptions came, instead of the British going in, because it is an overseas territory, and helping to resettle and rebuild Montserrat, they told the people, come. But in coming, they did not give them the rights of full citizenship. And the disparity continued there. As it relates to species, I'm not sure who in here has seen a dinosaur, but they haven't. And that again is evidence of species that have become extinct. The world is at an inflection point. And the only people who are going to save it are the people of the world who will put the pressure, I hope, on the governments of the world. We are at that stage now where not just Christianity, but almost every religion has at its core the pursuit of the common good. And it is therefore that we must turn at the individual and national level. And if we are successful in so doing that, then I believe that our efforts internationally and to achieve the kind of fundamental reform and change of which I spoke, it then becomes within our reach rather than an esoteric concept spoken by some academics and some romantic politicians. I'll pause at this stage. Thank you.
Let us now open this conversation, this dialogue. We live in a world today that faces, as we know, a variety of crises which are interconnected. As we heard, these include climate, biodiversity, water, health. To tackle these now urgent issues, let us consider and discuss how a new economics of the common good can help create well-designed and much-needed action. But first, let me ask you both about your exchanges with Pope Francis today. You both had an opportunity to meet with him privately at the Vatican. In fact, you had this morning 2 opportunities to meet with him. Prime Minister, you've just returned from Baku, where you spoke at the COP29. And it is evidence to all that this has been a year of extremes. Was climate, among others, an issue you discussed with the Pope?
I'm not usually in the habit of discussing private things publicly, so you have me a little on the back foot this evening. What I will say, however, is that it is impossible for me to have a conversation with anyone today without discussing the season of superlatives. And that is how I describe the climate crisis. Every week and every month, we are hearing about the hottest, the coldest, the driest, the worst. And regrettably, we are not going to be able to reverse a lot of it. We can take back about up to half a degree if we reach concrete action on the control of methane. Methane, whatever you want to say, will naturally expire and get out of the Earth's atmosphere within 12 years. And the scientists have advised us that if we can control the volume of methane that is being produced in the world, we can effectively see ourselves taking a greenhouse gas that is 80 times as dangerous as CO2. 80 times. And while carbon stays in the atmosphere for much longer, methane will come out, and they believe that it can reverse us by half 1 degree. So we discuss many things, but as I said, I can't have a discussion with anybody without talking about this climate crisis. Part of the difficulty is that if we are going to survive, we have to adapt and build resilience. And there is not much fiscal space in most countries to be able to do so, largely because countries would also, in addition to the climate, have incurred significant debt during the pandemic in order to keep lives and livelihoods going. And then secondly, the increase in interest rates that would have occurred since the pandemic has also put an excessive burden on countries and reduced the fiscal space even further. I know His Holiness has been a strong advocate for debt relief and indeed for seeing in many instances debt as a form of slavery that really needs to be addressed frontally. And if we look at it, we put the most burden on the countries that can least carry it. So that we have these definitions of safe assets and all of these other things that will reduce the cost of money for those who are most capable of repaying, and for those who are least capable, they end up paying 3 or 4 times the same amount, even though they may have the same credit rating. I refer all the time to even before COVID when we had now paying multiple times more than Greece, in spite of the fact that they had the same credit rating. So these are some of the things that bother us, because if we are going to adapt and to make an environment that is conducive to our people not losing their lives or livelihoods, we need to spend money now. And that's why during the pandemic, Kristalina Gordieva had an approach that we would do well to follow. She said, pay the bills, but keep the receipts. The world needs now to recognize that we are in a race against time in the next decade. And unless most countries build the resilience, whether in terms of strengthening coastal infrastructure, looking at alternative sources of water, ensuring just transition to energy, ensuring that we change how we build our houses and our roofs, because hurricanes take roofs and then they take lives. Unless we change all of these things in the next decade, we will accept that there will be loss of lives and indeed a shift in housing patterns. And if we think we have a migration problem in the global north, we have not even begun to see what that migration problem will be. I invite everyone to go and look at the map of Africa again and look at the brown belt across Africa. Is not by coincidence that the level of migration and the level of insecurity and the level of terrorism lies essentially across that same belt. Because if you can't farm to support your families, what next are you going to do? You become a ready soldier in somebody else's war. And these are the things that remind us. So those are some of the things that I would ponder on, but I really am not at liberty to discuss what it is.
Thank you. And Professor Mazzucato, you might want to share some of your moments and your meeting with the Pope, but I also want to say the idea of working for the common good and the need to redefine an economic model to achieve this appears to be the way forward, but can you outline for us and explain what this actually means in concrete terms, and what kind of measures and decisions really need to be taken at this stage? So what really needs to happen here? So if you could maybe share something about the Pope meeting, and then we can get into the discussion.
Sure. So also, we had an event, I can't remember when it was it wasn't February, here with the Academy of Life, where we actually used the Pope's not only teachings, but his, again, rigor, but also courage to not just talk about the problems, but to be very clear that this requires to rethink how we do capitalism. He uses the word capitalism. He looks at the financial sector. He's talked about this financialized form of capitalism, which has led to the inequality. In fact, the first time that I had that kind of personal connection with him was when he actually cited one of my books, The Valley of Everything, in Argentina, and a speech he gave, and he later joked that I owed him some money because he made me famous in Argentina. But this point that actually this is about doing capitalism differently is hugely important, right? Because as both the Prime Minister and the Archbishop talked about, this is a result of choices we have made. There's nothing deterministic that has to happen, that we have a corporate governance structure, for example, globally, which has led to 7 trillion. The Prime Minister was talking about 500 billion a year through a financial transaction tax. 7 trillion has been used in dollars just to buy back shares to boost stock prices, stock options, and executive pay by the large corporates. There's nothing deterministic in that. That's a particular form of corporate governance that's really just led to quarterly returns. That has also seen very little reinvestment of profits back into the system to improve working conditions, let alone a more sustainable production process. So that's a corporate governance structure. There's nothing deterministic in this lazy form, as I said, of the way that we design our public institutions, at best fixing markets as opposed to what? Actively shaping and creating an economy in the markets that serve people and planet. And the concrete way that this kind of thinking then has to land is also to admit that the problem is not that we need public-private partnerships to be focused on climate. It's actually to have measures, concrete metrics that, for example, tell us whether the types of partnerships we have are the kind of symbiotic, mutualistic partnerships or problematic, parasitic, predator-prey kinds of partnerships that we've seen, for example, in the health sector, where in many countries lots of the investment in the most radical new medicines, what in the health area you might look at in terms of new molecular entities with priority rating. Often that research comes from the public sector. The private sector, of course, is part of that innovation process, but then the prices of the drugs don't reflect that collective value creation. The way we've designed intellectual property rights doesn't reflect that collaboration. Why? Because often the patents, the intellectual property rights, are too wide, used for strategic reasons, too strong, hard to license, too upstream, so we're actually patenting the tools for research, which is not what patents are for. So the way to concretize these ideas of actually building reciprocity, mutualism, symbiosis, and the common good in contracts literally has to happen at every single contract. Think of water rights. Often it's the state that owns the water rights, which then gives those rights to Anheuser-Busch or Pepsi-Cola. How can it be that 80% of industrial wastewater is not recycled? Just put it in the contract, right? That's a reciprocity relationship. You're being given by the state the right to the water, and in exchange, you're going to innovate and invest in such a way that that right is also helping to improve that system. Think of what happens also with the large tech companies. We call them tech companies, but often that tech actually came from public investment. And we actually haven't been able, and hopefully we will, wake up and do this with the future of AI, to embed in all the different kinds of grants and relationships, those public-private collaborations around the innovation that has led to this technology, a way to make sure that we govern that technology from the beginning in such a way that we don't end up with the huge problems that we've had and that we know now we have, and it's too late now because it's very hard to react to it after the fact around privacy and the way that these technologies are being used. As Shoshana Zuboff says, you think you're searching Google for free, well guess what? Google is searching you for free. So what does that mean? It also means to put into the contracts for innovation some of these issues. Very interesting, a recent example, I had the honor to work with the Secretary of Commerce in the United States. Her name is Gina Raimondo. I found out she actually comes from Ischia, her family. She was in the Biden team. She made sure that, for example, a very large grant to the semiconductor companies in the United States, which has been framed in terms of the CHIPS Act, because the United States is trying to be more sovereign in chips production, to not over-rely on Asian chips production. She made sure that those contracts with those companies were good contracts, to make sure that the profits that were generated were reinvested back in, that they were reinvested, so not share buybacks, that they were reinvested into improving working conditions, and also reinvested to improve the energy efficiency of chips manufacturing. And we've talked about the water problems. Every day, the large chips manufacturing plants use over 10,000 gallons of water. That's more than 33,000 households every day in the United States use. And we know there's huge water inequity in terms of the global south and the global north. So embedding in any sort of contract, whether it's an innovation contract, whether it's a water right contract, these principles of equity and justice, both nationally and globally, are incredibly important. By the way, lithium, right, which is being produced which is in many countries, for example, in Latin America, Argentina, and Chile, and Colombia, that's solving one problem, right, in terms of electrification that we need for the climate battle, but actually, unless we embed, again, conditionality in terms of how these natural resources are being extracted, to make sure that they are not, again, as water extracted and not polluting the waterways, then we solve one problem with one hand and create a problem with another. So these problems we talk about have to be looked at systemically. The SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, the UN's 17 goals that came about actually through a huge process of consultation. They didn't fall top down from the UN. Each and every one of those should actually be leading to these kind of missions that can have resonance at the local, the national, and the global level, but we need to look at them again systemically. Often the solution to one might be causing a problem somewhere else. So really understanding that kind of systems-wide problem, the need for collective action, but to always land that collective action in the very concrete way that we produce contracts, matters a lot. And I was very inspired by the work in Barbados, actually, that the Prime Minister worked on during COVID-19, the Barbados Employment and Sustainable Transformation Program, the BEST program, where you, with your goal of making your island's tourism not just fun for tourists, but sustainable and good for the workers working in it, you thought about conditionalities with the hotel industry. So we have a more regenerative tourism sector and a less extractive one, where the hotels were being asked to retrain workers, to green and digitize their infrastructures, and to actually just have a more inclusive and sustainable form of production across everything that tourism, which is almost a microcosm of what happens in the city. Everything happens in tourism. We eat, we move, so the transport, the food, the building materials can either go one way or another, but that requires a different contract with those companies. And actually, I think you face lots of resistance. And so we need to remember that this is also a question of negotiation and of battles. None of this stuff, again, happens deterministically. And we need to learn where it works, where it doesn't, and that's why I always say, if we do it during war, why can't we do it for everyday normal periods? Why can't we use, for example, procurement, which is such a large part of government budgets, for normalizing the moonshots, for example, around school meals? In Sweden, they have a moonshot. They say, we want every child to have a healthy, sustainable, and tasty school lunch. And in order to deliver that, the state works with the private sector across the whole food chain around local food manufacturers to deliver that innovative criteria for something as normal as lunch. And that also diversifies the food manufacturing. It renders it more competitive, less reliant just on the big monopolies. And so we also need to be thinking about all these problems that we're talking about, not just to solve the equity issues, but this is a different form of growth, right? You can actually provide growth opportunities, market opportunities, creating markets, scaling small and medium enterprises through this outcomes orientation. And so bringing together these discussions of, battling inequality, but creating a different direction for growth can only happen if we actually use all the different levers from procurement to public loans to grants to subsidies to COVID bailouts. There's lots of different levers that currently need waste. And so embedding within them in all those different contracts, because all those examples I just gave, there's contracts within them of issues around reciprocity, mutualism, symbiosis, and goal orientation.
And Prime Minister, you are behind something called the Bridgetown Initiative, now 3.0. Can you explain for our audience what this is about and what the objectives were when this was first thought of and then developed as time went by?
Thank you. Bridgetown Initiative, as I said, because of the reasons I outlined at the beginning, where we felt that we needed to be able to communicate the urgency of the need for reform of the global financial institutions, we brought together a range of people, not just from within Barbados, but from across the world. And Mariana, was the first time we met, and we were humbled by the extent to which persons were ready to cooperate with us to create a short document that spoke to the need of reform, but also reflected what many vulnerable countries, some low income, but also some vulnerable middle income countries were going through. We have seen some success over the 3 years. The Resilience and Sustainability Trust was something that we were calling for, and the IMF has introduced that to provide middle-income vulnerable countries with long-term finance for the very first time. We've been speaking about natural disaster clauses, as we would call it. The World Bank, the UK government and the Export Credit Agency, and a few others are now picking it up. And what is that? Very simply, that if we got hit tomorrow, God forbid, by a bad hurricane, that we would immediately have the right to suspend all of our debt payments, principal and interest, for 2 years, which would give us the fiscal space, the equivalent of about 70-80% of GDP, just from that single act over a 2-year period. There is no country, no government, no entity that's going to give us that kind of money to rebuild immediately after. And we can see, even though we've formed and agreed to the establishment of a loss and damage fund, the capitalization of it so far is only at 700 million, which does not even begin to cover the range of disasters that the world has seen this year alone. So while we saw success on some of those things, there are other things that we're not yet successful on. Martin, we had in the last one, the elimination of surcharges, and I want you to know that Martin Guzman, more than any other Minister of Finance globally, led the charge for the removal of surcharges by the International Monetary Fund. And these surcharges mean that even though we were paying back our loans with interest, we were penalized if we didn't pay early by having a surcharge put on us. And we were penalized if our quota, we asked for more than above a certain percentage of quota. In October, 2 months ago, the IMF reduced those surcharges finally by 37%, having spent 2 or 3 years telling us there was simply no political will on the part of board members to be able to do so. Bridgetown 3.0, therefore, does an assessment of where we are after the successes of 1 and 2 and after the failures of 1 and 2, and puts out again now a framework. We consulted widely on it, and essentially it is broken down into 3 parts. 1, changing the rules of the game, because as we said, and ironically we've seen some movement on that. Christina has now announced the Sub-Saharan Africa gets its 3rd seat on the board. But as you would know, whether it is the Security Council or whether it is the international financial institutions, the boards are not representative of the countries whom they represent. And that is a problem because half the time when decisions are made, it's not actually always a wicked decision intentionally. But if you don't know about me, you can't know the impact that something is going to have on me. And if I'm not at the table, ironically, Shirley Chisholm, who Kamala Harris credits as being one of the forerunners for being able to be where she is because she was the first black American woman to be elected to Congress and the first black American woman to run seriously for a presidential nomination in 1972 in the Democrat Party. And the centenary of her birth is on the 30th of November this month, which is our Independence and Republic Day, and which she is Barbadian as well, so we take credit for that. But effectively, what we have, she would tell us that if, when you come to the table, there is no chair for you, bring your own folding chair. And that is the approach that we are taking with the first set of Bridgetown 3.0. Change the rules of the game. And we're not going to stop until we do that because we just simply do not have them represented in that. Even the notion that the head of the IMF must come from a European country nomination and the head of the World Bank from the US government's nomination is anachronistic in today's world. The second part of it is how do we shockproof vulnerable economies? Made the point that a lot of our economies that have come out of poverty are at risk of going back into poverty. And secondly, a little known fact that 70% of the world's poor actually live in middle income countries. And therefore, unless we can shockproof these countries that are vulnerable, we're going to find that they will become new sources of migration. But worse than that the countries themselves will not be able to withstand serious crises coming at the same time. And if we doubted that it was possible, the last 4 years show us what a polycrisis movement looks like. The third part of it relates to simply increasing significantly the sum of money needed to save both people and planet. And we start first with the recognition that let us deal first with those countries that cannot help themselves because they are still very much in poverty. And within a few weeks' time, there will be the closing of the idle round. And we would like to believe that we can see the world commit to the $120 billion that is necessary for the replenishment of either, although we are already hearing excuses being mounted in different corners of the world. But for us not to come to their rescue would be tragic. At the same time, we argue that there is need for the mobilization of far more domestic resources and then mobilization of far more international resources through the multilateral development banks and the regional development banks, and that we can increase the amounts being met by one, looking at their balance sheets and seeing how we can better stretch it. Two, I've given you the examples earlier to the global public goods and the levies that we would want to see. And that we need also to deal with the fact that most private sector investment does not go to the global south because of lack of information and lack of comfort levels. And that is part and parcel of the old racism hangover that we have not properly confronted and dealt with, that allows us not to see people as they should be seen.
And I think
that's just a broad framework, but it's on the net, and please.
I think, Professor, you want to add something there, and one thing it sounds like that dealing and finding a way to resolve the existing disparities is absolutely of fundamental importance, but I think you wanted to add something to what...
Well, just what the Prime Minister is talking about is essential, and it comes back to my point before that we can't just look at this as a pot, a hole to fill, a financial gap. There is actually plenty of finance out there. It's just not going into the direction that we require. Just some numbers, to top off the really important numbers she talked about in terms of the levies and shipping. There's 7 trillion that went to fossil fuel subsidies in 2022. Just to remember, trillions are 12 zeros, right? So a lot of what Bridgetown was trying to do was in the billions. There are trillions out there being wasted in terms of fossil fuel subsidies, in terms of the share buybacks that I talked about. This represents a lack of reinvestment of profits, which, by the way, are often created collectively, right? Profits don't just come out of a genius of a private sector company. These are often results of collective action that then aren't reinvested in but are financialized. She also mentioned, just to remind you, that 0.1% basically the financial transaction tax could raise up to $500 billion a year, but another $5 billion a year just in solving the basic stuff which we know how to solve, but we've chosen not to solve in terms of tax avoidance. And I'm not even talking about tax evasion, just tax avoidance, $500 billion a year. And the companies that do this, by the way, aren't just using the international loopholes. Just in California, Apple, which has its headquarters in Cupertino, California, moved its subsidiary to Reno, Nevada, to save $3 billion in 1 year. And that same year, the state of California's deficit went up, actually by $3 billion. It wasn't 1 for 1, but the point is, every time that taxes are avoided, states, regions, nations have less money to then spend on all those things that we absolutely know are important: public education, public health, and so on. So these are actually crimes, and we know how to solve them. We just choose not to. And she talked about the public banks, which have been a very important part of the discussions both around Bridgetown and other global initiatives. There's huge amounts of money in national public banks, like Cassa Depositi e Prestiti in Italy, like KfW in Germany, like BNDES in Brazil. There's over $20 trillion in the multilateral development banks, like the IDB, like CAF, like the European Investment Bank. There's $2.2 trillion. We are not seeing an alignment of these funds that are actually then helping us solve all the different problems that we've talked about. In Italy, as you know, often the public bank just gives out money to sectors who say, help, 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 I'm in trouble, as opposed to saying, why are you in trouble? Have you not been making those kinds of investments that are required to become more competitive, to green your supply chains and so on? In Germany recently, because they had a very clear mission around their Energiewende, the KfW, their public bank, made the loan to the steel sector conditional that sector lower the material content of production, which is the only reason that we have green steel in Germany. And there's no green steel in Italy, there's no green steel in the UK where I live, because there isn't that, again, reciprocity in the relationship. So just moving away from this idea that we just need more money and recognizing that there's huge amounts of money that we're wasting, and that the financial architecture, as the Prime Minister talks about, and as it was central in the Bridgetown Initiative, has been unjust, because those countries in the developing worlds that have borne the consequences of the ways that the global north developed, facing now the consequences of that climate change, are also facing the consequences of a very dysfunctional financial system, which often put as a condition for the loans to reduce the fiscal space, right? Just this voodoo idea that you need to reduce your deficit in order to get a loan. So you call that the double jeopardy, you're basically being screwed in 2 different ways. Sorry, I shouldn't use these terrible words. I'll do that again. Anyway, both from the climate side and the financial side. So being very forthright that we need to change the global financial system and stop just saying we need a bit more money here, a bit more money there, and then expect the philanthropies to fill the gap of dysfunctional government and dysfunctional business is absolutely central. And we need to be raising an alarm bell, I think, of how we're going back to the Middle Ages. We're overly relying, I believe, in the kind of philanthropic, kind of charity income to save the day because of these fundamental dysfunctionalities.
Yes, so let's talk about philanthropy for a moment. This is a subject that is also discussed at the present time. Is it something that is needed at this stage?
Well, I'm not sure. The reality is, as Mariana just said, because of the consolidation of wealth, we have a significant amount of philanthropic capital globally. We believe then in the same way we would ask multinational corporations to step up, that we would want to have a global compact among the philanthropic organizations, that while they can spend, or while they spend money on what they really love and what they're passionate about, that they live on the planet Earth, and that they need to leave a few cents on the table again for what the world needs, as opposed to what they're passionate about alone. And if we could get them to agree that they would leave 3, 4, 5 cents of every dollar to be part and parcel of financing the global public goods, then it would enhance significantly what is available to us to help in this race against time. I hope that over the course of the next 6 months to a year, as we go into COP30 in Brazil, that we can have some meetings with the philanthropic entities, in major ones at least, and get them to meet among themselves and lead the way in this regard. But to leave them out as a significant pot of money would not be just. And at the end of the day, all of us are going to suffer if the planet is affected. And all of us will suffer if the other things that affect people, whether it is crime or pandemics or whatever, is also affected. Anything that affects citizen security or public health.
Just to add the philanthropy point, unless we tackle why these excess profits, what Adam Smith, Karl Marx, and David Ricardo call the rents in the system, so these excess rents in the system that have been accumulated, for example, by some very large technology companies that then set up foundations and philanthropies that then speak with the United Nations to talk about climate, unless we actually start better understanding where these excess rents come from, then it's very hard actually to solve the system. So take Amazon, which hardly pays any tax in any of its global jurisdictions, which has been accused by global labor leaders to have very problematic labor practices. If you haven't seen Ken Loach's film on this, go see it in terms of the conditions that these white van drivers often have, sometimes having to pee in bottles, and having very problematic working conditions, as also Apple, through the Foxconn accusations and so on, have had. And so these profits in excess rents that have been accumulated by certain companies, which then put 0.1% into a foundation, right, which then ex post or is trying to help with different problems, whether it's climate or something else. That's a dysfunctional way to actually tackle global capitalism's problems. What we need is good corporate governance. We need companies to be paying their tax, to be paying workers a living wage, to improve working conditions, to have sustainable business practices across their whole supply chain. And then if there's anything left over, by all means, of course, philanthropy has always been a very important, progressive, if you want, force for good, but not when those funds are actually coming from a problematic corporate governance structure.
We could continue talking for forever, but I do want to ask Professor Mazzucato one last question regarding the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. Do you think there have to be changes made there? It looks like there is discussion about changes to be made within these two institutions. What is your idea of this?
Yeah, I mean, leaders do matter, and I think, and the Prime Minister knows this more than I do, which I see, she, due to her role, often meets with the new leader of the World Bank, Ajay Banga, and the leader of the IMF, Kristalina Georgieva, who actually, I think, have been trying to implement certain changes. However, unless they actually go to the structural problems in terms of the voices at the table, the Prime Minister just talked about, that the Bretton Woods system does not represent the global South, and it came about in an era that was very different. It was already unjust then, but it's even more unjust now. And if unless we truly combat the kind of austerity, let's just use the word, which is the very frank word, which is that the loans that are being provided to many countries continue to be conditional on those countries promising to simply cut their deficits, which we know then start to create problems that those countries have where the cost of inaction ends up being greater than the cost of action. If you don't properly fund your public health system, you don't properly fund your public education system, if you don't have a public transport system and a sustainable public transport system, if you don't have a capable civil service, right, by investing within the training of that civil service instead of doing what Italy does, which is the riforma della pubblica amministrazione, which ends up just being cuts to the public administration. None of these things, in the short run, it might look as though the deficit has fallen, but in the long run, what we know, ironically, is that the debt to GDP actually rises because you're cutting all those things that create a stronger social fabric, that also create a more well-being in the workforce, that create a more innovative economy. So it's not only bad for people, every time we have cuts to public health, it's bad for people, but it's also bad for the long run, right, growth of those economies. And unfortunately, what I'm seeing now, especially after COVID, where some countries had a bit more generous provisions because people were really hurting, then all of a sudden COVID is over and we hear again that countries are tightening their belts in order to get the fiscal balance back. And that doesn't work. And if the IMF and the World Bank don't truly radically change their own understandings of how economies function and make sure that the loans are not conditional on deficit reduction, but conditional on investments that those countries need to be showing that they're making to make their economies more sustainable, more ethical, more inclusive with these common good principles that we're talking about here, then we just continue to create the problems that create misery, let alone climate change and so on.
If I can just make 2 quick points. One, Marianne is absolutely correct that the leadership of both institutions have improved significantly in terms of what they've done. The major blockage now to speed and scale, however, is not the 2 leaders, but in fact the countries who constitute the board. And that's why, Martin, you had problems. We didn't have a problem persuading management of books or charities. We had a problem persuading countries. And that's where the political advocacy has to be. In the capitals, all of a sudden, heads of government, like they don't speak to ministers of finance or ministers of economy. So there's a disparity between what is said in the Senate and what is said in the boardrooms by the representatives of the ministers of finance. Secondly, I really do have to say that I grew up at a time when people believed that the fund was exacting from populations that which populations could not have at all. The truth is, and I don't know if it's because the last 2 years were women, but the truth is that at the IMF we have been able to do a lot of investment because we put together a fabulous program which was premised on investment, so that within going into an IMF program, we reintroduced free tertiary education at the University of the West Indies. In an IMF program, we refitted our entire transport board buses at a time when the last government had not bought a bus for a decade. We gave 3 salary increases in 6 years, when the last government gave 1 in 10 years when they were not in the IMF program. We increased investment and built up a new accident and emergency for our major loan hospital. And I can go on and show you other investments that we made that were critical for the preservation of social capital. Now, I'm not going to tell you that that has been the experience in every country, but we literally had to go in and make a case, and we did the work such that we also had a simple principle which they accepted, which you know well, Mariana: share the burden and share the bounty. We determined that some of the burden had to be carried not just by those who live in Barbados, but if you have 3 times the population size visiting you every year and using your infrastructure, they've got to carry some of the weight as well. And we found other ways to have a larger denominator to be able to reduce the incidence on individuals. What was not anticipated, but they were also very cooperative with us on it, was that we had basically $2 billion structural adjustment programs in 5 years, One because we went to the IMF, and the other because of COVID. To put it in context, 2 structural adjustment programs of about 10% of GDP. That's not a minor thing. But we were able to do it by sharing the burden and sharing the bounty. The other thing that we did was that we said to the population, and this is why what His Holiness keeps reinforcing in us in terms of the dignity of agency and speaking with people in his book Dream. We said to the population, expenditure is either essential, highly desirable, or optional. We're going to go through this exercise, but we want you to go through it with us. We have a social partnership in Barbados, which is over 30 years old now. That is Labour, the private sector, and us. And we went around the room on my first day in government. I went around the room and asked a simple question: who in here wants to save the Barbados dollar? And everybody, of course, puts up their hand. I said, okay, everybody give me the top 3 to 5 things you would do to save it. At the end of that conversation, 80% of what was put forward was the same thing. The assessment of what was essential, highly desirable, and optional, however, was not limited to the social partnership. We then went to the country and we did one of these online polls, as well as to engage with those who could not be online. And in the end, we had 5,000 people in a population of 200,000 adults really participate, which is about 2.5% of the population, which is a much higher participation rate than most countries have on any issue. And that is what made the commitment to share the burden and share the bounty possible. At the same time, in an IMF program, we increased the reverse tax credit to people earning under $1,000 US a month. We also made it possible for those who earn between $1,000 and $1,500 US to get something called a compensatory income credit. In other words, pay your tax monthly, but we will give you back every cent at the end of the year, so long as we don't have a fiscal challenge. And we've been able to do it every year for the last 5 years. We were also able to reduce people's income taxes, but what we did was to replace that, as I said, with something that is born in terms of our international travel, so that took up an additional portion of the revenue, so we didn't have it only on the domestic population. So I don't think that all things are gone, but I do recognize that the battle is not over and we have to fight, and more often than not, the battle is in the countries. With respect to the World Bank, we were graduated 30 years ago and told that we're millennium and that we can't borrow at all. IDRD financing. In fairness, in absolute utter fairness, when COVID broke, I was chairing CARICOM and I wrote President Trump at the time and I said, look, this is unjust. Our countries are being affected by both the climate crisis and pandemic, and as middle-income countries, we ought to be able to borrow still. And he responded positively, having in the past given us stress. During the occasion of the pandemic, they changed their position and agreed to exceptional access. Last year we said, you can't just give us exceptional access to the pandemic. It could be climate as well. This is an existential crisis. And in fairness, once again, under the new leadership of President Biden, we've now been re-admitted to be able to have access to IDRD financing. But that took a lot of lobbying as well, not at the level of management, but at the level of political capitalism. That's where the problem is. That's where the changes have to be made. That's where the pressure has to be.
Thank you both ladies for this enlightening conversation. I'm going to now bring this to a close. Maybe Archbishop, you'd like to say a few words before I bring it to a close. The floor is yours.
Grazie. Per me è stato un onore e anche un grande arricchimento potervi ascoltare. E credo sia per tutti però utile poter riflettere su quanto abbiamo detto. E mi chiedo, questo incontro noi l'abbiamo promosso sfacciatamente per appoggiare il Papa, ma non perché per un orgoglio cattolico, no, perché è l'unico che oggi parla per tutti. Non c'è nessun luogo al mondo dove il capo, tra virgolette, pensi a tutta la famiglia umana. Ciascuno pensa a se stesso, se va bene al proprio popolo. Ora io credo che quando ci siamo detti per aiutare il Papa, o meglio per aiutare questa prospettiva, io mi chiedo, ma le cose che avete detto, che noi abbiamo ascoltato, perché devono restare chiuse in questa stanza? Parlava della COP30 in Brasile, ma non potreste, assieme anche a noi, anche all'Accademia, preparare un testo, un patto per la vita, come testimonianza di queste riflessioni da presentare e da proporre. È un modo, a mio avviso, di contribuire anche da parte vostra e anche da parte nostra, lo dico dell'Accademia, perché queste prospettive, che sono teoriche e pratiche, possono avere anche un eco che certamente aiuterà la resilienza di coloro che hanno una buona volontà, a qualunque fede e cultura appartengono. Ecco perché io sono lieto, grato di quanto avete detto. Io mi auguro che possiamo lavorare nei mesi prossimi per questo testo. Non è il patto della speranza, ma è il patto della vita con la lettera maiuscola che comprende la vita umana e la vita del pianeta. Grazie.
After this closing statements that you just made, and after the recent COP29 in Azerbaijan, the next big opportunity for countries to come together and collectively to discuss how to reform the international financial architecture will be at the 4th International Conference on Financing for Development to be held in Seville, Spain, from June 30th to July 3rd of next year, 2025. No doubt, eyes will also be on the G20 summit that will be held in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil next week, to see what emerges from that. Again, before closing this meeting, I'd like to thank Archbishop Paglia and all of the staff here at the Pontifical Academy for Life who worked to make this event a success and actually take place. I thank all of you participants for being here tonight, and all of the followers on YouTube, and I wish every and each one of you a very good evening.
Per un ultimo pensiero finale, ma prima di lasciarci, io sono non così rigoroso come la primo ministro, quindi io non dirò quello che il Papa ha detto, però una barzelletta finale, me la permettete? È una barzelletta papale. O meglio, non solo, perché l'ha detto questa mattina. Quando presentavamo il marito della professoressa, il Papa l'ha visto, io gli ho detto, non c'è? Ah no, ecco, io gli ho detto che sarebbe andato subito in paradiso, che è il